So now that we've talked about how language normally develops, we are going to talk about what happens when language learning doesn't happen the way that we'd expect. So language impairments and other associated disorders. And keep in mind that everything that we're talking about today is child specific. You will learn more about adult language disorders later on. So one thing to keep in mind with these kids is that language might be their only problem, but it might not be. They might have other challenges at the same time. So if they have a genetic syndrome, this is quite likely that they'll have some other difficulties. They might have trouble with motor skills, cognition, play skills. They might have trouble with speech sounds and be really hard to understand. They might be stuttering. They may have a history of trauma. So there could be lots of things going on. There's the potential for it to become quite complex. We know that kids with language impairment tend to show a higher chance of having trouble with sustained attention as well. And that's kind of a chicken or egg situation. We're not exactly sure why that happens. It could be that they are struggling with language because they're not as able to pay attention to it as some other kids are. Or it might be that they are having trouble paying attention because they don't really understand all of the language that's happening around them. So right now, what we know is that those two are correlated. One doesn't necessarily cause the other. We also know that how they do with language might be significantly worse than how kind of smart they are or what they can show you as far as their cognitive skills on nonverbal tasks where language isn't involved. So for a lot of these kids, if you strip language out of a task and just have them, for example, look at shapes and point to shapes or draw pictures or something that doesn't use any language, you will find that they're actually doing better than they can do in tasks that require language, which makes sense. If kids have a delayed expressive vocabulary at 24 months, they are at increased risk for later speech and language problems. And this increases with family history as well. So if you have a sibling, mom or dad, especially in that immediate family, an immediate family member who has struggled with language, that definitely puts you more at risk for having trouble yourself. We know that kids with language impairments, there are occasionally kids who will outgrow them, but for many of these kids, it impacts a wide variety of things in their lives, and it also impacts their adulthoods. So they don't necessarily grow out of it. And they tend to show poorer outcomes in a variety of measures, even at 34 years of age. So well into their adulthood, they're still doing comparatively worse than their typically developing peers. So this is the way that we're going to talk about language challenges in kids. So there's one group that's called late language emergence or late talkers. And then we're also going to talk about language difficulties, language disorder associated with X, developmental language disorder, and social communication disorder. So if a child is having language challenges, they may end up with any one of these labels depending what age they are and what's going on with their communication. So without knowing anything else at this point right now, I just want you to make a guess about which category Mo and Julia might fall into. When we say language disorder associated with X here, that means that X means some other biomedical condition. So for example, language disorder associated with Down syndrome. So go ahead and take a guess, and we'll find out later. So the first group that we'll talk about is those kind of late talker kids. This is what Asha calls late language emergence. And if you see on our chart, we actually have this separately off to the side instead of a category down below. The reason I put it here is that these kids kind of may or may not actually have impaired language. What we know is that they're a little bit older than we expect, and they're still not talking. Reasons kind of unknown at that point, and we're not sure if they're just taking a little bit longer to meet their milestones or if something more serious is going on. Whereas all of these categories down below, we are pretty sure that there is a bigger problem. They're not just late. All right. So what is a late talker or a child who has late language emergence? So typically we would say these are kids who are delayed in their language onset, so they haven't started talking when they should, and they have no other diagnosed issues. There's nothing else we know that might be causing that. This occurs in 10 to 20% of 2-year-olds, and it's actually 3 times more common in males. These kids are otherwise healthy. There's nothing else that seems to be wrong with them. And how do we decide if someone's a late talker? Well, the criteria we usually use is that at 2 years, they have less than 50 words and no word combinations. So remember, we know that 50 words and some word combinations should usually start happening about 1.5. If that hasn't happened by 2, that's when we start to be concerned that they could be a late talker. What puts you at risk for being a late talker? Well, gender, obviously, as we've said, if you're a boy, you're more likely to be a late talker. Poor motor development, birth status, so if anything went wrong when they were born or if they were born prematurely, that puts you at risk. Their language ability at 12 months, so if they weren't meeting their milestones at 12 months, it's more likely that they'll be a late talker. Family history of late talking could put you at risk. If they have siblings, they're more likely to be a late talker, potentially because they're kind of sharing that conversation time with other people. They're not getting all the attention for themselves. And we know that lower education of the mother and the family's socioeconomic status can also put a child at risk for being a late talker. What seems to help and make late talking less likely is really that access to good healthcare, being raised in an experience where you're getting rich, varied language exposure, so lots of different activities, talking to lots of different people. You have family who actually talks to you and are interested in talking to you. And that goes along with having a responsive learning environment as well. So remember, we talked about that idea of serve and return, caregiver being really engaged. That is protective. Access to printed materials. So remember, we talked about early literacy activities. That can be protective as well. Involvement in a wider variety of play activities and conversations, engagement in different motor activities, basically just kind of giving kids lots of things to get into and be interested in can help, and good access to communication services as well also obviously makes a difference. There is a video I've posted on eClass about late talkers and when to worry. The video is by Dorothy Bishop, who is a prolific language researcher, and she's huge in her field, so it's not required, but if you're interested in late talkers, definitely go take a look. It's very short, just a couple of minutes long. What we know about these late talkers is that they might have trouble just with expressive language, or they might have trouble with receptive and expressive language. We are always much more concerned about kids that are struggling with both receptive and expressive. That's more serious. And obviously, if you think about functional impacts of not being able to understand what's said to you are major. We know that these kids are at risk for language and literacy difficulties later on. And these kids are interesting because of these kids, there is actually a high proportion of them that will catch up to their peers by the time they're 3 to 5 years old. And the estimate is actually 50 to 70% of kids who are late talkers probably will catch up. This is more likely if they're only having trouble with expressive language. And these kids who were late but then recover later, these are the kids who we do talk about truly as being late talkers. Other kids who continue to have difficulties that persist will go on to get a different diagnosis because they have not obviously recovered. So 50 to 70% seems pretty good. It seems like a lot, but you also have to remember that that means that there are 30 to 50% of these late talkers who are not recovering and who will continue to have challenges. Now, one thing that's really interesting is that this 50 to 70% who do recover, who we truly think about as late talkers, they may not have enough trouble to be identified as being delayed at any point, but when they take language tests later on in life, they do get lower test scores than their peers who were never late talkers. So still in the average kind of range, but always on the lower end compared to kids who never had trouble. So that's interesting and something to keep in mind. They kind of never gain proficiency that's quite as high as their peers. The other thing to think about is that monitoring of these kids is really, really important because late talking could be just late talking, but it could be happening for other reasons as well. There may be something else that's going on with that child that hasn't been found yet. Often when you think about what parents notice, they notice when their kids aren't talking, sometimes before they notice that there are other things that are actually problematic as well. So always important to pay attention. And we also have to really make sure we think about the child's language background. So if they are learning 2 languages, for example, It may look like they're not talking as much as they should be, but maybe they're still really building that receptive language in both languages. So it's just important to know how that might affect the child's language development. The second box on our graph from before was language difficulty. That's one of the boxes that was on the bottom row. And so language difficulty is a term that we would typically use with toddlers or preschoolers. And we might use this when they're not showing typical language development, they're not meeting their age expectations, we don't know why this is happening, and we're kind of not sure which way it's going to go. There's a chance that they might recover, but there's also a chance that we think the language difficulty might persist. And we're basically, in this case, too uncertain to use the late talker label, because the late talker label kind of implies that nothing's seriously wrong. But for these kids, we're wondering if maybe they're not just a late talker, we're just not sure. And with these little guys, it's really a wait and see approach. It's about labeling them with language difficulty, explaining the areas of language that they're having trouble with, and then kind of seeing what happens. Is it going to resolve, or is it going to be a longer term difficulty? So now we're going to get into talking about actual language disorders where we're quite sure that something is definitely wrong. And this is the ASHA definition of a language disorder: is an impairment in comprehension or use of spoken, written, or other symbol system. The disorder might involve form of language, content of language, or function of language in any combination. So that captures what you kind of know already. You can have a language disorder if you have trouble in any of these areas. Dorothy Bishop also outlines some additional considerations for us when we're thinking about labeling language disorders. When would we not use the disorder label? We would not use it for late talkers who are fine by the time they're 5. We would not use it for kids who are having uncomplicated phonology trouble and they just have a speech sound disorder. So remember, even though phonology is technically an area of language, we usually consider that more in the speech domain. So if they're just having trouble with phonology, they wouldn't be able to have this label. We wouldn't give it to kids who have had very little exposure to the language that they're supposed to be learning, like in our case, English. And it doesn't matter how good your nonverbal cognitive skills are. Whether your nonverbal skills are great or whether they're poor, you can still have a language disorder label attached to you if you're having trouble with language. So the first thing that we'll talk about is language disorder associated with X. And remember, this is when that language disorder is associated with a biomedical condition. Different conditions this could include might be brain injury, hearing loss, autism. We talked about genetic conditions or neurodegenerative conditions, cerebral palsy. The idea is that the child has something that causes known impacts on language development. And this biomedical condition is actually causing the difficulty in language. If the child is having trouble with language, but does not have any of these other conditions, you would not get a diagnosis of language disorder associated with X. We're going to talk about how that would be labeled later on. And what we know is that for these kids, any assessment and intervention that you do with them really has to take that condition into account, because it's a huge part of what they're experiencing at that time. Some of these kids need more intensive intervention. Some of these kids have a whole host of other challenges that they're dealing with at the same time. Some of these kids spend a lot of time in the hospital and have very high medical needs and often urgent medical needs. So all of these things need to be considered. And we are going to talk a little bit more about some common biomedical conditions in a moment.